The sky over the Mekong darkened not with sunset, but with the shadow of war. The year was 1591, while distant empires pursued power. A storm gathered over Cambodia that would scar its soul forever. Once the heart of a mighty empire, Cambodia had declined. Angkor's temples still stood, proud but crumbling. Now the capital was Longvek, a city of hope, learning, and royal ambition. But to the west, Ayutthaya saw that hope as a threat. Under King Naresuan, a warrior forged in Burmese wars, Ayutthaya was hungry for expansion. What began as raids soon became a full invasion. Between 1591 and 1594, Cambodia was torn apart. Longvek fell. Tens of thousands of nobles, monks, artisans, children were chained and marched into Siamese captivity. This was more than war. It was the dismantling of a civilization. And while history tried to forget it, Cambodia never could. This is the story of that forgotten war of blood, chains, and memory. Part 1. The storm gathers. The year was 1591. The sun rose over the flooded plains of Cambodia, as it had for centuries. But the calm hid a gathering storm. In the west, across the borderlands, the kingdom of Ayutthaya prepared for war. And at its helm stood a man determined to carve his name into history through fire, blood, and conquest. King Naresuan. The war that followed would shake the Khmer world to its core. It would burn the capital, enslave the noble class, and leave a trail of devastation that still scars the collective memory of Cambodia today. This was not a simple border skirmish. It was a war of domination, a war of vengeance, a war to break Cambodia's soul. The Khmer Empire, once the unrivaled titan of mainland Southeast Asia, had long fallen from its Angkorian peak. In its place rose a humbled but defiant kingdom, headquartered in Longvek. After the abandonment of Angkor Thom in the 15th century due to internal decline and relentless Siamese incursions, Longvek became the new center of Khmer administration and royal authority. But even there, safety was an illusion. The new capital may have stood near the Tonle Sap and Mekong rivers, protected by swamps and rivers, but it could not hold back ambition. King Naresuan of Ayutthaya had one goal: to cement Siam's dominance over all its neighbors. And Cambodia, wounded and isolated, was the weakest link. The pretext for invasion was thin. Thai chronicles claimed Khmer forces had provoked Ayutthaya by raiding border regions and refusing to send tribute. But the reality was far simpler. Ayutthaya wanted more land, more slaves, and more prestige. Naresuan saw Cambodia not as a neighbor, but as prey. In 1591, he launched his first invasion. Thai armies pushed eastward, crossing the Dangrek Mountains and descending into Khmer territory with fire and fury. Khmer chronicles described these raids as sudden, brutal, and overwhelming. Towns were burned, civilians slaughtered, women and children taken as war captives. The Khmer army, under King Satha, attempted to hold the line, but the Siamese brought new military tactics and more disciplined troops. Ayutthaya had learned from its past conflicts with Burma and had modernized its forces, adopting firearms and foreign mercenaries. Cambodia was still rebuilding from past wars and internal strife. The Khmer military, reliant on war elephants and traditional formations, was no match for Naresuan's brutal efficiency. The first invasion did not capture Longvek, but it rattled the kingdom's foundations. For King Satha, the writing was on the wall. Cambodia stood alone. No foreign aid would come. Vietnam, in its own period of chaos, offered no assistance. The Spanish and Portuguese, while present in Southeast Asia, saw little benefit in involving themselves in a Khmer-Siamese feud. King Satha scrambled to reorganize defenses. Forts were rebuilt, troops re-upped. A few European mercenaries were brought in to help train the army. But even these efforts were too little, too late. In 1593, Naresuan returned. This time, he came with a larger force. He had already defeated Burma at the Battle of Nang Sarai and secured his western front. Now he turned his full attention to the east. The Khmer chronicles lament, that the invaders moved like a wave, unstoppable and merciless. Siamese soldiers, experienced in siege warfare, began surrounding. The Thai army used river routes to transport supplies and troops, choking off the capital's access to trade and reinforcements. Khmer soldiers tried to resist but were overwhelmed. Treachery, too, played its role. Some nobles, fearful of punishment, reportedly surrendered forts to the Siamese. Disunity eroded Khmer resistance from within. Inside Longvek, panic set in. The city, once hailed as the bastion of Khmer culture, was now under siege. Families fled or huddled in fear. Nobles debated desperate options: flee, fight, or negotiate. King Satha, facing dwindling hope, sent envoys pleading for terms. But Naresuan was not interested in compromise. He had come to destroy in 1594. After months of encirclement, Longvek fell. The Siamese stormed the city. Khmer sources described the fall with sorrow and rage. Temples looted, homes set ablaze, nobles rounded up and chained. Thousands were deported. Men, women, children marched westward into Siam to serve as laborers, concubines, or court entertainers. These were not just prisoners of war. They were the architects, artists, scribes, and priests of Khmer civilization, the backbone of its culture, torn away in chains. Among them were royal family members, hostages. To ensure Cambodia's submission, Ayutthaya celebrated its triumph. Thai chronicles boast of how Naresuan took revenge on the Khmer, who had once dominated the region centuries earlier. Cambodia was no longer a rival. It was a vassal, broken and humiliated. In Siam, the captured Khmer were paraded like trophies. Some were given roles in Siamese administration. Others were forcibly assimilated. The loss was not only military, it was cultural, psychological, and civilizational. Cambodia's legacy was shattered, its royal bloodlines scattered, its capital defiled. But the suffering did not end there. In the wake of Longvek's fall, Cambodia plunged into a political crisis. King Satha fled to Laos and died in exile. A puppet king, Beremritia III, was installed with Ayutthaya's approval, but his reign lacked legitimacy. Resistance movements flared in the countryside. Some Khmer nobles refused to accept Siamese rule and launched guerrilla attacks, but the damage had been done. Longvek's destruction marked the end of a unified, independent Cambodia for decades. Siam, meanwhile, tightened its grip. Provinces in western Cambodia were absorbed into Ayutthaya's orbit. Tribute was demanded, Khmer sovereignty reduced to a shadow. The War of 1591-1594 was not the beginning of Siamese aggression, it was its climax, a culmination of a century of incursions and power plays, and it would not be the last. Cambodia's borders continued to erode in the centuries that followed, but Longvek was the turning point, the moment when Cambodia went from regional player to a weakened vassal. To this day, the fall of Longvek remains a wound in the Khmer historical memory. It symbolizes loss of sovereignty, dignity, and control, a memory of foreign chains and stolen futures. In Thai narratives, it is often framed as a righteous victory, but in Cambodian memory, it is a tragedy of stolen peace and brutal betrayal. And yet, even in the darkest hour, the Khmer spirit did not die. Resistance continued, survivors endured, and through centuries of occupation, Cambodia's cultural soul survived, scarred but unbroken. In the next part, we will explore what happened after the fall, how Ayutthaya governed the conquered regions, how Khmer resistance reshaped itself, and how Cambodia tried to reclaim its shattered pride. The war may have ended, but the consequences echoed for generations. Part 2: Broken Chains and Burning Temples. Ayutthaya's wrath upon Longvek. Longvek had once seemed invulnerable. Tucked inland and protected by rivers, it had risen to prominence after the fall of Angkor, becoming the royal seat of the weakened Khmer monarchy. In its early days, Longvek represented hope for a fallen empire. Foreign traders, Spaniards, Portuguese, Chinese, and Japanese passed through its harbors. It had walls, an army, and a court full of Khmer nobility, who dreamed of restoring their kingdom to glory. But it also had weakness, one that Ayutthaya would exploit. In part 1, we witnessed how the reign of King Naresuan brought a dangerous new ambition to the Siamese throne. Determined to expand Ayutthaya's influence, Naresuan launched a military campaign in 1591 into Cambodian lands. It was more than just a punitive raid, it was the beginning of an invasion that would end in blood, fire, and the destruction of Longvek. But the road to conquest was not easy. Cambodia did not fall in a single strike. Instead, it fought desperately, and at times effectively against a more organized and aggressive foe. The Cambodian king at the time of the invasion was King Satha, a monarch whose reign was defined by instability and foreign meddling. Some of it came from the Spanish and Portuguese missionaries in his court. Others came from the internal factionalism of his royal advisors. But the greatest threat of all came from the west, from Naresuan's first campaign in 1591 was fierce but inconclusive. Though Ayutthayan forces crossed into Cambodian territory and sacked border towns, they were repelled before reaching Longvek itself. Khmer warriors, though numerically inferior, used guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain to slow the advance. Jungle ambushes, flooded rice fields, and swift cavalry counterattacks caught Siamese troops off guard. For a moment, Cambodia breathed a sigh of relief. The invaders had been turned back, and the kingdom remained standing. But this moment would not last. It was only the calm before a second, more devastating storm. In 1593, Naresuan returned. This time, he was better prepared. With the Burmese threat at bay and Ayutthaya's resources consolidated under his strong hand, he directed a massive military effort toward Cambodia. His goal was no longer just to punish, it was to conquer, to dominate, and to remove the Khmer threat permanently. Naresuan's forces marched east again, burning and looting villages along the way. But this time, he employed a two-pronged strategy. While one column moved along the traditional invasion route, another swept down the Mekong, aiming to cut Cambodia in half and surround Longvek. Khmer defenses collapsed in stages. Local governors surrendered or fled. Without reinforcements or strategic leadership, many frontier towns fell without a fight. Khmer morale sank as refugees streamed into Longvek, telling stories of Ayutthayan soldiers who showed no mercy, burning temples, enslaving villagers, and executing those suspected of resisting. Cambodia was bleeding. At the royal court, King Satha panicked. He appealed to the Spanish and Portuguese mercenaries in his service for help. Some accounts mention that Portuguese soldiers fought in the final battles around Longvek's defenses, armed with muskets and cannons. But they were few, and they could not compensate for the disunity within Cambodia's ranks. Internal divisions plagued the kingdom. Some Khmer nobles distrusted the foreign mercenaries. Others saw Ayutthaya's invasion as a consequence of Satha's weak rule and began plotting to replace him. The royal court fractured just when unity was most needed. Even as Ayutthaya's forces approached the capital, debates raged inside the palace. Should the king flee? Should the foreigners be expelled? Should peace be negotiated? But the answer came not from a diplomat or general, but from the thunder of cannons and the smoke that began rising from the outskirts of Longvek. Ayutthaya had arrived. The siege of Longvek was methodical and brutal. Naresuan knew that the city would not surrender easily. Its fortifications, though aged, were still strong. So, he ordered a full encirclement. Khmer supply lines were cut. No food came in. No messages went out. Starvation and panic set in. Those who had once feasted in noble halls now ate rats and leaves. Disease swept through the cramped capital, and still, the Ayutthayan bombardment continued. Cannons, likely captured from Europeans or made in Ayutthaya's own foundries, blasted the walls day and night. Meanwhile, Naresuan's engineers dug trenches and built siege towers. Every day, the circle around Longvek grew tighter. Every hour, the Khmer resistance weakened. Finally, in 1594, after weeks of siege, Longvek fell. The final assault came from multiple sides, overwhelming the defenders. Khmer soldiers fought bravely, but were too few. Some nobles attempted to flee on boats, others surrendered. The city was overrun, temples were looted, palaces were set ablaze, and King Satha vanished. Some say he fled to Laos, others claim he was captured, but what is certain is that he never ruled again. The once proud capital of Cambodia now lay in ruins. But the conquest did not end with Longvek's fall. What followed was even more devastating: a mass deportation of the Khmer elite. Ayutthayan soldiers rounded up thousands of officials, monks, scholars, artists, and royal family members and marched them back to Siam. This was not an act of mercy, it was a deliberate strategy. By removing the brain of Khmer society, Ayutthaya sought to break Cambodia's ability to resist, to erase its cultural and political leadership, and to transform it into a vassal forever. These Khmer deportees were paraded through Ayutthaya like trophies. Some were forced into labor, others became concubines or servants in the Siamese court. A few, perhaps, were allowed to live as nobles, but always under surveillance, always with their past erased. It was cultural decapitation, a strategy, not of immediate extermination, but of slow, humiliating assimilation. One of the most heart-wrenching consequences of the fall of Longvek was the loss of continuity. The Khmer Empire, once the master of Southeast Asia, had now been reduced to a broken shell. Its people, traditions, and memories were scattered. Parents wept as children were taken. Monks looked on helplessly as their libraries were burned. Stories tell of Khmer dancers being forced to perform in Siamese courts, symbols of the kingdom's stolen glory. Temples that once echoed with prayers now lay in ash and silence. Cambodia had not just lost a war, it had lost a part of its soul. And yet, even in this darkest hour, there were signs of resistance. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Khmer uprisings flared in the countryside. Guerrilla bands harassed Siamese garrisons. In some villages, local leaders declared loyalty to phantom kings and tried to reignite rebellion. These efforts were brave but ultimately futile. Ayutthaya responded with brutal crackdowns. Fields were burned, populations relocated, and rebels executed. The message was clear: resistance would not be tolerated. But for Ayutthaya, victory came at a cost. The invasion had stretched its resources thin. The region around Longvek, though conquered, remained unstable. And while the Khmer capital had fallen, the spirit of its people had not been entirely extinguished. New leaders would eventually emerge. The capital would move again, this time to Odong. The story of Cambodia would continue, scarred but unbroken. As the 16th century closed, Southeast Asia stood at a crossroads. Empires rose and fell, but memory endured. The fall of Longvek marked a turning point, not just for Cambodia, but for the region. It signaled the end of Khmer dominance and the rise of Siamese expansionism, but it also planted seeds of hatred, grief, and remembrance, emotions that would shape Cambodian identity for centuries to come. For the Khmer people, this war was not just about territory, it was about survival, dignity, and the enduring pain of being betrayed, abandoned, and conquered. The forgotten war of blood and chains may not be found in every history textbook, but its legacy lives in stories passed from grandmother to child, in the ruins of Longvek's temples, and in the quiet rage that lingers when a nation remembers what was stolen. Ayutthaya had won a victory, but Cambodia would never forget the price. Part 3. Echoes of Chains. The Khmer nobles who never returned. The fires of war had died down, but the ashes of Cambodia's soul continued to drift in the wind. As the dust settled over the ruined capital of Longvek, a quiet, suffocating stillness spread across the plains that once echoed with the chants of monks and the laughter of children. In their place now stood ruins, scattered bones and chains fastened around the necks and wrists of thousands of Khmer captives, forced to march toward a foreign land they had never seen but would soon be forced to call home. Ayutthaya's armies had succeeded not merely in battle, but in humiliation, occupation, and dismemberment. King Naresuan's campaign had culminated in the complete dismantling of Cambodia's ruling class. The streets of Longvek were eerily empty in the days after the final battle. Smoke rose from still smoldering homes, pagodas, and granaries. Statues of the Buddha had been beheaded or toppled over, their stone faces cracked open and cast into weeds. The once proud royal court of Cambodia was no more. King Satha, already weakened by previous defeats and incapable of rallying further resistance, had fled into exile before the final assault. His absence had left Longvek rudderless and vulnerable. Some of the royal family followed, vanishing into the jungles or seeking shelter among loyalist provinces, but many were not so lucky. The survivors of the Khmer elite princes, court ministers, monks, generals, scholars, and noble women were rounded up by Siamese troops and placed under tight military guard. They were shackled together and made to walk in long, agonizing columns from Longvek to Ayutthaya. Witnesses described their gaunt, tear-stained faces. For many, this was not simply a journey of forced relocation, it was a death march of national identity. Khmer culture, at its zenith during the Angkorian Empire, had already been waning for over a century. The fall of Angkor in 1431 had been a wound, but the fall of Longvek was a dismemberment. Now, with its brain trust and soul being dragged away in chains, Cambodia's light flickered dangerously close to extinction. The deportations were not an incidental outcome, they were a strategy. Ayutthaya's leadership, under King Naresuan, sought not merely territorial gains but intellectual and spiritual conquest. They understood that by seizing the Khmer intelligentsia, they could harvest Cambodia's ancient cultural wealth. This was a systematic plundering not just of gold or land, but of minds, traditions, and identity. Khmer poets, astronomers, priests, and architects were forcibly integrated into Siamese society. Many were compelled to contribute their skills to Ayutthaya's court, temples, and institutions. Over time, Khmer cultural influences became woven into Siamese court rituals, architecture, and literature. But for the Khmer people, these were not contributions, they were losses. Families were torn apart. Khmer noblewomen were forced into marriages with Siamese officials or taken as concubines. Monks were compelled to serve in unfamiliar temples under foreign religious interpretations. Children were separated from parents, renamed, and raised under Siamese tutelage. In the palaces of Ayutthaya, Khmer voices were heard not as dignitaries but as servants, jesters, and entertainers, ghosts of a fallen civilization, reanimated for foreign amusement. In time, many would forget their lineage. Others were denied the right to pass it on. This was how memory dies, not with flames, but with silence. Yet resistance did not vanish entirely. In the provinces and rural regions, Khmer peasants, minor warlords, and Buddhist monks began to organize. Some hid relics and manuscripts from invading forces, others conducted small-scale uprisings or sabotage. Still, these acts of defiance were no match for Ayutthaya's military dominance. Naresuan had committed to a long-term occupation strategy. Garrisons were installed in key locations across Cambodia, and loyalist Khmer figures were appointed as puppet administrators. They had no real power, serving merely to placate the population, while Siamese officials controlled tax collection, military recruitment, and religious oversight. A sense of spiritual despair settled over the Khmer population. With their leaders gone, temples desecrated, and sacred symbols destroyed, many turned inward, clinging to local traditions and folk memory. Oral histories became lifelines. Stories of Angkor's golden past were whispered to children in the night, not as tales of hope, but as reminders of what had been lost. The trauma ran deep. Generations would grow up under foreign domination, conditioned to see themselves as lesser subjects of Siam, shadows of a once great empire. Naresuan, for his part, returned to Ayutthaya as a triumphant conqueror. His victory over Cambodia reinforced his image as a righteous unifier of the Thai realm and a scourge to his enemies. Court historians in Ayutthaya glorified the campaign, minimizing the brutality and emphasizing divine justice. They framed the Khmer deportations as a civilizing mission, casting Ayutthaya as a superior culture bringing order to a chaotic neighbor. These narratives would endure for centuries, deeply coloring Thai interpretations of history. Cambodia's suffering was not just obscured, it was rewritten. But not all Siamese were blind to the human cost. Some Buddhist monks within Ayutthaya criticized the treatment of Khmer captives, arguing that it violated both moral law and the sanctity of religious brotherhood. These voices were quickly silenced or ignored. The state had no room for dissent during its golden era of expansion. Khmer identity within Ayutthaya became a quiet tragedy, existing in whispered prayers, carved scripts on hidden walls, and the fading tattoos of exiled warriors. Some Khmer deportees kept journals in secret. Others etched their names into the bricks of monasteries. Most were forgotten. The international reaction to the fall of Longvek was minimal. In the 16th century, Southeast Asia remained largely disconnected from the global power structures forming in Europe and the Middle East. Even neighboring kingdoms like Vietnam or Lanshan offered little more than condolences or polite neutrality. Cambodia was left to bleed alone. The regional balance had shifted. Ayutthaya had proven its supremacy, not only militarily but culturally and psychologically. Cambodia had become a broken realm, its heart stolen, its history amputated. But history has a long memory, even if written by the victors. Over time, fragments of truth survived. Ancient chronicles, poems, and local oral traditions retained the memory of the Siamese invasion and the fall of Longvek. These were not only recollections of loss, they were testaments to endurance. Even as Ayutthaya grew and prospered, a sense of karmic imbalance lingered. Empires built on conquest eventually decay. In the centuries that followed, Ayutthaya itself would face invasion and ruin. Sacked by the Burmese in 1767 in a fiery crescendo of retribution, the Khmer people, though wounded, would survive battered but unbroken. The fall of Longvek and the deportation of the Khmer elite remains one of the darkest chapters in Southeast Asian history. It was not merely a military campaign, it was a cultural erasure, a psychological conquest, and a spiritual catastrophe. The scars remain etched in Cambodia's landscape, in the ruined stupas of Longvek, and in the quiet sorrow of those who still speak of lost ancestors. It was a war not just of weapons, but of chains that bound not only bodies but identity, memory, and voice. Today, the legacy of that war can still be felt in the tension between Thailand and Cambodia, in disputes over temples, borders, and historical interpretation. But beyond politics, there is a human truth that cannot be ignored. A nation's soul cannot be broken forever. Though kings may fall and capitals may burn, the spirit of a people endures, in memory, in ritual, and in the quiet defiance of survival. Let us remember not only the victors of history, but those who endured its cruelties in silence. Let us speak the names that were erased, and tell the stories that were almost forgotten. Cambodia may have been bound in chains, but it never stopped breathing. Its story, buried under centuries of domination and distortion, is rising once more. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.